So now all of a sudden, Summer Lee and Ayanna Pressley are reintroducing H.R. 40. Now, H.R. 40 is a bill, has been in Congress for quite some time, about the need to study reparations. Again, it is important that I say that, and I'll show you a little bit of that bill in a second. I do not want you to fall for this. I support reparations. I advocate for reparations. Those of you who watch me, you know this. But it is very important that it is done in a certain way because of legality reasons. And it is also important that if you're really trying to make this be a thing, that you would introduce this during a time when you know the Republican Party doesn't all have the House and the Senate. I want to show you what Democrats do. This is why a lot of my anger goes towards the Democratic Party, because they try to play us as fools. The Republicans say things out loud, out in the open. The Democrats, like, they try to pander and do things as if we don't know better. Like, that's what pisses me off. So again, 100% support reparations and advocate for it. But you really need to know what this is about. H.R. 40 is not what you think it is. So here is Ayanna Pressley. Listen to this.
Honor to reintroduce H.R. 40, historic legislation to establish a federal commission to examine the lasting legacy of slavery, to develop reparations proposals for descendants of enslaved Africans. It is an honor to inherit the privilege of carrying this bill forward.
Oh, Lord.
From Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. In my last correspondence with her, she said, keep working on our priorities and never give up. She was the previous House sponsor of H.R. 40 and a true giant in the movement for reparative justice. We are grateful for her leadership. We are grateful for her example and her voice. May she rest in peace and power. And we are grateful to be joined here today by her daughter, former Congresswoman Erica Lee Carter, who today, when I thanked her for braving the elements to journey here, said true justice is never convenient. I want to acknowledge some of our partners in good trouble in this fight. Senator Cory Booker, our co-lead in the Senate, Chairwoman Yvette Clarke of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, Congresswoman Latifah Simon, Congresswoman Summer Lee, and the more than 70 members of Congress who have signed on to co-sponsor the legislation that was first introduced. And I want to make this point because it is Black History Month. And while there are those that are working actively, either to erase our history or to whitewash it, that I'm here in this moment to pick up the mantle of this historic legislation that has been championed by John Conyers, Congressman John Conyers, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. That was introduced more than 30 years ago when Congressman John Conyers was a co-founder of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Pause. All right. So we already see some of the issues, right? This has been around for over 30 years. H.R. 40. And of course, she's like, well, it was brought out through the Congressional Black Caucus. Now I want you to answer this question, okay? The Congressional Black Caucus advocates more for Israel than they do for Black people. I did a whole video about this, right? They urgently jump to advocate for Israel. But this bill has sat in Congress for over 30 years. Why are they bringing it up now? Right? Who's president right now? Who has control of the House? Who has control of the Senate? They know that this is already dead. They're doing it to prove a point. Again, for those just joining, I 100% approve and support reparations. But H.R. 40 is not reparations. Now, I'll show you that. And it's definitely not cash reparations. This is something that Democrats have a tendency to do. They wait until they are not in power to try to introduce legislation or reintroduce it or push an issue when they know it is not going to pass. But when they have a chance and they have some type of narrow majority, they don't take advantage of that either. I want to take you back to Force the Vote. Never forget, there was a whole Force the Vote town hall, and that ask was for the progressive members of Congress who at that time had a narrow majority, and that includes Ayanna Pressley, by the way, to withhold their vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker in exchange for a floor vote for Medicare for All. The strategy behind this comes directly from the DSA handbook, Democratic Socialists of America. That when you have a narrow majority, this is what you would do. None of them were willing to come to the town hall, and none of them were willing to withhold for their vote. This was during the pandemic. They weren't willing to put pressure on Nancy Pelosi during a pandemic to give people health care. And the idea was to bring it to a vote so everybody can see who voted against it. And then those people would be primaried and you get them the hell out of there. This, to me, I felt like that strategy made perfect sense. And I didn't even have a show during that time. But I watched all this unfold on YouTube. And I was just like, I can't believe they didn't even try. Didn't even try at all. So it's theater, what you're seeing right now. Ayanna Pressley knows this isn't going to pass. Summer Lee knows this isn't going to pass. Now, let me ask you a question. They can bring this forward knowing that it's not going to pass, it's dead in the water, but they weren't willing to force the vote for Medicare for All, even though they said, well, it's not going to pass back then. Does everybody see this game? I don't want them to deceive you because they end up revealing who they actually are. And by the way, Ayanna Pressley was my representative. I actually voted for Ayanna Pressley her first term. When she ran the first time, I voted for her. She was my representative, so I'm very familiar. And she was a city councilor in Boston before she ran for Congress. She actually did some good things as a city councilor. Once she got into Congress, that was it. They all change when they get in. We'll go on a little bit more here.
We're at a critical inflection point in America, and the moment cannot be more urgent. With Black history under attack and white supremacy emboldened, there is no better time to introduce this bill than during Black History Month, a time when we reflect on our history, our struggle, and our collective power. And I'll say, it is also not only about Black history, but it is about Black futures.
Didn't we have Black History Month last year? Didn't we have Black History Month in 2024, 2023, 2022, 2021? Everybody see what's going on here?
More than 4 centuries ago, Africans were kidnapped, trafficked, and enslaved, forced to build this country under horrific brutality, an economy which we still benefit from today. Rice, sugar, tobacco, cotton. And even after the Civil War, emancipation, and the 13th Amendment, the legacy of slavery endured in other forms, codified in law to deny Black Americans freedom, opportunity, and dignity. And that's what brings us here today. This brutality, these injustices, these horrors were not things just happened within the culture by osmosis. They were legislated. Today, with Donald Trump and Republicans waging their coordinated and at times unlawful assault on Black folks and Black history, we will not allow that history to be erased.
Pause, because she walks into this for me. So I disagree with the removal, obviously, of Black History Month. We wouldn't even have to have a Black History Month if Black history was taught throughout the year in the regular curriculum. And for those who say, oh, it is, don't come for me. I worked in education for over 10 years. No, it's not. Unless you go to a Black school. That being said, it's interesting because I told you this is really about Trump. This is really about Donald Trump. And that's what she said it herself, right? So she said, well, he's doing this and da 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 da. Well, let's talk about erasure, right? Because see, I seem to remember that there was a senator at one point, Joe Biden, who co-wrote the crime bill with racist Strom Thurmond. Joe Biden and Strom Thurmond responsible for taking Black men out of the home, putting harsher penalties on them for drugs. Nobody should go to jail for 20 years for weed. And it's interesting considering how many states now have legalized it. But have they freed those people? Massachusetts hasn't, I can tell you that much. So Ayanna Pressley was totally fine with endorsing sleeping, down and out, can barely function Joe Biden for president. This is when he was still in the race. She was totally fine with endorsing Joe Biden, who co-wrote the crime bill that directly impacted Black communities, primarily Black men. But now she brings up Donald Trump and she said, oh, he's trying to erase Black History Month. Did Donald Trump co-write the crime bill? This is the thing I continue to tell people over and over again. I have my criticisms of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump did not produce legislation that locked up Black men for a long time for things like weed. Joe Biden wrote legislation. So if you have that feeling, Ayanna, towards Donald Trump, you should also have had that feeling towards Joe Biden. But that didn't stop you from endorsing him. You did so because he was a part of your party. So what does that say about the Democratic Party? That you guys were fine with openly embracing Jim Crow crime bill Joe. This is all theater. And I do not want you to be deceived. This is not what you think it is.
We will not allow it to be whitewashed. H.R. 40 is a powerful reminder of the work that remains and offers us a pathway toward truth, reconciliation, and accountability. To be clear, this bill is not a symbolic gesture, but rather a meaningful step toward repairing the deep structural injustices that continue to harm Black communities today. The racial wealth gap in America is not an accident. In Boston, my home city, the Federal Reserve counts Black wealth at just $8, compared to the wealth of white households at $247.
Yeah, I don't know why it flashed there, but she's correct about this. This was a study done by Dr. Sandy Darity, who has also been on the show. There is also organizations here in Massachusetts that are actively working to try to get reparations here in Massachusetts. They're trying to do it on the state level. They're doing great work. I think they were just on Tim Black's show earlier today, so definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. But they're not trying to wait for Congress. They're not trying to wait for the president or anything like that. They're like, no, we are trying to right the harms and the wrongs that were done in this state, right? And I think they learned quite a bit of maybe what not to do or some things to avoid by watching what happened in California. But I think California is also putting forth other efforts. Let's go forward a little bit more.
$1,500. Nationwide, the racial wealth gap is over 10 trillion. That's trillion with a T. This shameful reality is the direct result of generations of precise, intentional policy harm codified into our laws and budgets. And it is specifically the result of slavery and the anti-Black society that followed. From Jim Crow to redlining to mass incarceration, our government, through policies and budgets, has perpetuated and entrenched these harms for generations. The disparities that we see in health outcomes, housing, education, wealth, and more are by design. Today, our government has a moral and legal obligation to right those wrongs, and reparations are a necessary step towards achieving justice. Now, here's what the bill would do. H.R. 40 creates a federal commission, an expert body charged with investigating the enduring impacts of slavery and its aftermath, and developing concrete proposals for reparations.
So we'll stop with her there, and then I'll go to Summer Lee because I wanted you to hear what she said there. H.R. 40 is a study. H.R. 40 is not cash reparations. Now, I told you guys how I feel about these damn studies because the research has already been done. Oftentimes, when you hear a politician say we need to have a study of said issue, these bills go into a corner and they die. Why do you guys think HR 40 has been around for 30 years and nothing has come of it? Right? Because it's just supposed to be a study. Now, I'll show you that in just a second, but I do want to go to this part here from Summer Lee. Now, Summer Lee is a newer Congress member. She's from Pennsylvania. I want you to hear what she has to say.
I thank you, of course, to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley for carrying on this legacy, and of course to the late Sheila Jackson Lee, who carried this with pride for so long, for her efforts, to the advocates of this movement here and outside. Happy Black History Month. Happy Black Futures Month, in an era, of course, where Black history is attempted to be erased, or whitewashed. The America we know today was built on the brutal enslavement and trafficking of stolen Africans forced to build this country on their literal backs. Despite, however, what Trump and his anti-diversity, anti-equity, anti-inclusion cronies want you to believe, this is American history.
Pause. So do you guys see what this is really about? This is where they lose some of the legitimacy because, again, she's like, despite what Trump has to say, this has nothing to do with Donald Trump. When you bring Donald Trump into this conversation, you weaken your argument because then people will just hear, oh, they're just trying to do this despite Donald Trump. There's no reason to even bring him up. Reparations is a debt that is owed. This has nothing to do with him. You come forward with your data, your evidence, 40 acres and a mule, which did not happen. You bring all that to the table and you don't have to mention his name at all. Leave him out of it. People are laughing at Summer Lee and Ayanna Pressley, including people who support reparations, because they're like, oh, look, they're just trying to make this about Donald Trump. It doesn't make any sense. So it looks like they're just trying to be spiteful. Let me continue.
Impact is the American status quo. It's unjust and it is wrong. No matter what anybody says, the history of America is the history of America. Right. And acknowledging that history is not a threat to the present. Would argue that ignoring that history, however, is a threat to our future. No matter how many attempts they make to whitewash this history, the blood of our enslaved Africans ancestors can't be erased from this land. We must acknowledge that. We must acknowledge that the systemic racism that has denied Black folks the ability to thrive and to survive in this nation to this very day. We see it and we feel it every day because the barriers put up in place by our own government, because of redlining, because of predatory lending, because of inequitable funding schemes for our schools are very real. Our government, no matter who is in power, has an obligation to right these wrongs, to provide reparations for descendants of enslaved Africans, to eliminate the racial wealth gap, to uplift the Black community. White supremacy is rampant in this country. Just look at the current administration and our own legislative body. They have contributed to the social and economic harms, to racial terror Black folks have experienced in this country. Now,
there we go again. So she brings up the current administration. Look, we all know what's happening with the current administration, but that's not a claim for reparations. The claim for reparations is the debt that is owed to the descendants of those who were enslaved. And I keep hearing them change these words in and out. 1 minute it's descendants of slaves, and then the next minute it's Black community. And you have to be careful with that because Black community isn't necessarily those who are the descendants of those who were enslaved. So Summer came in pretty hyper. Look at this current administration. The current administration has nothing to do with the debt that is owed. And this is how you lose. This is how you lose the case for this. Instead of just coming in and making it about what is owed, what was promised, 40 acres and a mule, what was not delivered, you're talking about unpaid labor. We can get into Jim Crow laws. We can get into, she mentioned the redlining. She's correct about that. As long as you focus on that, okay, we get it. We got it. Some people still may not agree with it. But then you can also point to the fact that other groups have received reparations. You can point to the Japanese Americans that were part of the internment camps in the United States that did receive reparations and received cash reparations. You can point to other examples. But bringing up all these other, Donald Trump, his administration, yada, yada, it weakens your argument. This is it pisses me off. And then I want to show you this. Let me show you what HR 40 actually says, because it's not what you guys think it is. We're bringing up the actual bill. HR 40 commission to study and develop reparation proposal for African Americans Act. See, we keep switching out words because you got to be careful here. African Americans or descendants of slavery, freedmen. And the reason why that matters is because, let me bring this down here. The reason why that matters is because reparations is not based on race. It has to be based on status. You cannot say I'm giving everyone who's of African descent in the United States reparations. That would not pass. It would be thrown out in the court by the 14th Amendment. I've tried to stress this to people multiple times. But if you want this to work, you have to do it right. And it has to be able to pass the legal test. So that's important. And you're going to see this here. I'm just going to read the summary. To address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission. So we got these two words: address, commission, study. Okay. You can join organizations right now to study it. Hell, you can go to the library right now and study it. You can talk to Dr. Sandy Darity or read his book, From Here to Equality, to study it. He goes on to say here, and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans. Here we go with African Americans again. And the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. So first of all, Dr. Sandy Darity has broken down the required, what the cash amount should be, because he did the research. He did this, and not just him alone, but read the book From Here to Equality, okay? Because that actually explains why canceling student loan debt and baby bonds does not close the racial wealth gap. The only way that you close the racial wealth gap is through reparations, right? So this term African Americans, the term needs to be freedmen. This is going to hit all types of, remember the way the judge was able to strike down the student loan cancellation and all that kind of stuff because Biden didn't follow the proper steps the first time? That's what would happen here. Because technically, Elon Musk can say he's an African American. Isn't he from Africa? Doesn't he now live in America? So think about that for a second. So it should say freedmen. But this bill it's a study. It's not, we're going to get this much should be allotted towards, here's the dollar amount, here's da-da-da. It's another study. And they know that. And Ayanna knows that. And Summer kind of knew, so she might be a little in the loop. But Ayanna Pressley knows that. And bringing this up at this point in time, when Republicans have the House and the Senate, you know it's not going to pass. They are doing this for theater. It's a scam. You guys, I do not want people to fall for this. This is not real reparations. This is not cash reparations. I interviewed Rokana a couple of years ago and he mentioned HR 40 and he was like, well, no, it doesn't include cash reparations, but it implements, programs and da-da-da. Man, fuck a program. There's a lot of programs. We got plenty of programs in this country, folks. That does not pay the debt that is owed. Now, when it comes to any other group, they have no problem urgently passing legislation to make sure they get their just due. Am I correct? But when it comes to descendants of slavery, everybody got to drag their feet. And that's because majority of these Congress members do not work for us. White people, they don't work for you either. Majority of these Congress members work for their donors. That's who they work for. And that's why things don't get done. They will rush to urgently pass legislation for Israel. The ADL can come and make demands and say, this must be done. Let's rush and urgently pass this legislation. But not when it comes to us, though. When it comes to us, they ain't trying to pass nothing urgently. So Summer Lee and Ayanna Pressley, they know that this is not going to pass. So I say that looks can be deceiving because some people saw this on social media and they were like, oh, wow, they're finally getting reparations going. No, that is not what this is. And they're deceiving people by making them think that it is what it is, and it's not. And they know it's not going to pass. This term, and I'll show it again, African American, this is going to be dead in the water. This is not going to work. So we shall not allow ourselves to be deceived. Not on this show. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.